Adventures of the Brown Girl in Her Search for God by Elsa Kazi. "Where is GCD?" said the brown girl to the one-eyed Hegawait man, who had a matchbox in her hand and an "God bless you" upon her lip. It was always the same. Whenever the brown girl stepped out of her two-seater Rolls-Royce, she found this woman at her flat door with an underfed little girl by her side. As usual, she fumbled in her handbag in search of a small silver coin, and, as usual, she found no available change. She looked very beautiful in her scarlet frock and the daring little hat tilted on her jet-black hair. Her ivory skin was smooth and silky, and her dark eyes full of spirit. She was the only daughter of an Eastern potentate of fabulous wealth, whose headquarters were at the Ritz, and whose only craze was breeding pedigree dogs. She herself owned a gorgeous flat in Mayfair, wherein she could study, revel and sin. She was the leading light of a bright young set of her fellow students at the university where she studied history and economics. Today her head felt like a Catherine wheel. The cocktail party of the previous night had left her completely enervated, notwithstanding that they had given her a champagne bath, of course, of her own providing, just after she had finished dancing a La Army Flieger, the famous German dancer. The boys' business was to feed and stimulate her with flattery and flirtation, borrow money from her and never return it, and that of the girls was never to forget to say, "Olive, how lovely, it's just what I wanted," when costly presents were showered upon them. Friends, she had really none. Miss West, whom they called the White Girl, because she was a platinum blonde, at one time had posed as her friend when she herself had been in need of her support. The brown girl had substantially helped her. In fact, it was due to her that Miss West was able to graduate in economics and finance. But now, although she sometimes attended her parties, her real friends were business and sport. There was also one girl from Africa, the black girl who had been a student of divinity in her own way, and her sincere friend. But she had married an Irishman and given up her studies, and since then she saw very little of her. Almost every evening the brown girl gave a party at her flat to this host of parasites, who were entirely agreed on 2 points, that their hostess was perfectly charming, and that there was no God except the atom. They were also certain that the atoms had only come together by a fortuitous concourse, and could certainly not be credited even with gregariousness. Their jostling about, too, was more of a bullying sort, and that, they said, was the beginning of the struggle of life. The only law that ever governed the situation was, it you may by all means steal, if you only could get away with it. So long as your neighbor was in the dark, it did not matter what you did against him. Besides, if you could blow your own trumpet loud enough, it would drown a good many small voices. A little propaganda was sufficient to lead the big donkey of the public by the nose. Were not all the scientists agreed that the earth was round? So it must be a melon, and the only need was to possess sharp incisors and canines and specially good grinders, and the only talent necessary was to know how to bite. The question of right or wrong did not arise. The brown girl had to subscribe to this creed, as the greatest sin was to be out of fashion. No one had taught her different. Her mother she had hardly seen. Her nurses had spoken to her of Allah the Merciful. But since she had come to Europe the very name Allah had not recurred to her mind. It was only at times when at night she suddenly woke up, that she felt afraid of everything, afraid even of her own self, and in the depth of her soul felt a loneliness and a hunger for something she could not quite understand. Apologizing to the match seller, she now entered her flat. Her 2 maids flew to welcome her. "I don't want to be disturbed till 6 o'clock." So saying, she closed the door of her room, and dropping into the silk cushions of her divan, she closed her eyes and whispered sleepily, "Where is God?" "I will show him to you," said a voice beside her. She turned round and saw before her a tall man with a stern face and a hoary head. He wore a fantastic gown, all over embroidered and painted with animals, trees, mountains, and seas, hosts of men and women at war, at peace, and at lovemaking, crowds of children, strange temples, processions of priests, and pageants of kings and queens. "Who are you?" asked the brown girl, suspecting that perhaps he had stepped out of the last coach of the carousel. "I am history," he replied, with slightly relaxed face, and continued, "There are so many false personations of me stalking the earth. Fools believe in them, but knaves love them." "What has that to do with God?" asked the brown girl. "Everything," replied the man. "Were you not told that I am a sign of God? If you have lost your way, follow me." The brown girl jumped up. She felt her eyes now wide open. For a minute she hesitated. It was getting dark. She glanced at the jeweled dagger over the mantelpiece. Then she laughed, and shook her head. "We will not go very far," said the man, "it would tire you." In an instant he began to wax larger and larger. She could no longer see his head or limbs. His gown spread all over the hills and mountains, and at last she saw him no more, and she found herself sitting, on a vast plain, under a tree, occupied with painting, like naked body with colored clay. A sudden peal of thunder overhead startled her, and falling upon her face, she prostrated herself in terror before the thunder god, yelling in agony. The next moment she felt herself lifted by a naked man, who had a bundle of snakes in his hand. "That'll make us a fine meal," he cried, but she did not care for the tone of his voice, and wriggling herself free, she began to run without looking behind her. She did not know how long she had been running, when all of a sudden she found herself in the arms of her father-husband, surrounded by 20 other women, wearing kilts made of rushes and feathers. Her first act was to run inside the hut and prostrate herself before what looked like a green twig stuck in a clay ball. "Oh, high spirit," she said, "you who give us good pastures for our flocks, and shade, and plenty of kids, you have saved me from the arms of the snake-eating brute." At that instant she felt cold fingers clasp her arm, and turning round, she saw the youth who was in charge of their flocks. He was quivering from head to foot. "You are touching the taboo. They will stick you to a tree," cried the brown girl, whereupon he threw himself onto the ground and held her by the legs. "I cannot let you go," he said. "You have violated the taboo," said a horrified voice behind them. There stood the old man with a solemn mien, cursing, "You coward, not strong enough to capture yourself one from outside, you get hold of my women." There was an uproar, and the youth was dragged out to be sacrificed to the tree god. To ward off the curse, the brown girl liked the boy, and she implored the tree spirit to save him. But before she had risen, she heard the noise outside, informing her that the boy was already dispatched. In grief and anger, she kicked the image, and knowing the consequences of her act, she fled for her life. As she approached a river bank, she saw a tiger from a thicket, coming towards her. She cried for help, and with relief, she saw 2 men intercept the wild beast with their spears and kill it. "Where are you going?" "These thickets are full of leopards that attack our village at night," said the men to the brown girl. "You can accompany us, if your village is along the riverbank." "I haven't got a village, nor any people," said the brown girl. Meanwhile, 2 women, looking like brides, and carrying 2 small idols, joined them, and they, all together, proceeded along the river. The brown girl spoke to the women, but they laid their fingers on their lips and would not reply. As they slowed down, and the men were out of earshot, they said, "One must not speak to people in the presence of one's husband." The brown girl had fixed her eyes on their little idols. "Are these your gods?" she inquired. "Yes," they replied, "our family gods. We are taking them to our new homes, where we are going." One of the idols was a disc of clay stuck on 2 slicks. "This god is not a bit like the tree spirit," said the brown girl. "This is the moon god," said one of the women. "We cannot exist without him. He saves us from the wild animals and from snakes, and looks after our crops, and brings us rain." A crowd came out of the village to receive them, headed by an old priest. They had come to meet the brides and lead them home. The priest looked at the brown girl. "Who are you?" he asked. "Do your people plow the land?" "No, they used to drive the flocks," replied the brown girl. "Oh, so you are a roamer," said the priest. "You must pass through fire before we can admit you to our village." While the new brides were being made to walk round the fire, that being a nuptial rite, the brown girl, in terror, slipped away and hid herself in the village temple. Here she found rows of gods, one of them slightly more elevated than the others. "Oh gods! Save me from the fire," she gasped, out of breath, but as no response came, she cried, "You have no kind word for a maid in distress. You have no tongue so far as I am concerned, but even if you had them, they could not prevail against the flaming tongue of the fire." So saying, she rushed out of the temple. A woman with a baby, who saw her darting out at this unusual hour, was startled, and yelled, "A spirit," and she ran for the nearest cow, kissed its tail, and touched the head of her baby with its tuft. "May the mother cow protect you from the shadow of the evil spirit," she cried. ****. The brown girl had left the village behind her. She wandered through cornfields and woods, till she found herself in a big homestead, amongst cows and dogs. Utterly exhausted, she threw herself on the green grass and burst into tears. Her sobbing woke up thousands of parrots and miners that roosted in the trees, and in an instant the soundless forest was ringing with song of birds. This, and the golden horizon peeping through the branches heralding the sunrise, sufficiently raised her spirits to go and wash herself in the wood nearby. Hardly had she finished her bath, when the sound of a far-off flute reached her ear. She listened breathlessly, and walked in the direction whence the sweet music proceeded. The closer she came, the clearer and lovelier sounded the flute. From all sides now she saw young and beautiful damsels advancing with flower garlands towards the flute player. They all moved as though enchanted. The very air had ceased to breathe, everything seemed suspended, listening to the flute. No sooner had the wonderful melodious outpour ceased, than a cry arose, "The cowherd boy," and all the damsels rushed towards the flute player, and so did the brown girl, instinctively. Then she stood in front of a dark youth of magical beauty, and, as did others, so did she fall upon her knees, and they formed a circle round the youth. He greeted every one with a smile, but he repeated his gaze at the brown girl, making sure that he was seeing her for the first time. To reward them for their love and adoration, he played another entrancing tune. Just as he had finished, he threw away his instrument and danced a graceful roundelay with the Eunices. Hardly was the dance finished, when he cried, "Now, everyone, off to your work, or else your fathers will curse me. We'll meet again at noontide." They obeyed, hesitatingly, while going home, kept on looking behind, till they could see him no longer. The brown girl, naturally, remained where she was. "Who are you?" asked the youth. "I arrived here only this morning, and was thrilled by your flute," replied the brown girl. "How different one feels in this free forest, with no rites to perform. I would love to wash your feet 1,000 times with my eyelashes, but I am glad not to have to wash the Brahmin's feet for a day. I have seen the beautiful mage of Brahma, with 4 arms and 4 heads, and Eli great Shiva, and even the glorious Vishnu, and all Ikka lovely consorts, but now I have got a living God before me." The youth was somewhat startled at her last words. "Oh, I am only a cowherd," he said. "We do nothing the whole day but swim, sing and dance. I hope now you, too, will join us." He then untied a parcel he had with himself, and offered her a portion of the bread and sweets he had brought from home for his breakfast. "This is an enchanted world where I have landed," said the brown girl. "I never dreamt of this before." Bathing, playing, dancing and singing, this round went on for a long time, and the brown girl and the gopis doted on this beautiful boy as on some idol. Until, one day, he suddenly disappeared from their midst. The brown girl sat with the other damsels, weeping, mourning his absence. Till, one day a forest dweller, with long white hair, appeared and informed them that their cowherd boy was really a prince, and had to lead in the great wars that were being fought in the country, and after conquering and destroying the Rakshas, the wild tribes, had married beautiful queens, and had got hundreds of sons who all looked like gods. He also said that even the Brahmins bent their knees before him as their leader. "Will he never come this side again?" asked the brown girl. "No, never," replied the hermit. "To this place belonged his boyhood, his manhood belongs to somewhere else." the brown girl had felt that an entirely new page had opened in her life, and for this sudden irrevocable loss she was inconsolable. But then, she said to herself, I have got him still, for no one can deprive me of the memory of those beautiful days that I treasure within myself. His image is too within my heart. The morning sun, the trees, the lake, the wind, the clouds, all these gods that I used to worship before, I still adore, but how differently. I love them now, whereas before I was only constrained to bend my knees to them. Added to these, the birds, the flowers, the dances, and his divine music that he loved, I have learnt to love them all through him. I feel different and look upon the world with different eyes. Yes, I will not rest till I find him again. I'll walk and walk behind him till my chaos can carry me no further. Now it dawns on me, *Lif went on musing. How foolish these Aryan people were when they left their original home and discarded Zarathustra's gods, the maker and the destroyer. Because after coming here they adopted, all the same, those two, and even added a third, great Vishnu, the preserver god. So thinking, she started to walk in search of her god. She wandered through mountain, wood and plain, till arriving at a strange, unknown place, she was captured by two bearded, quaint-looking men with plaited hair, who carried her off to their camels and sold her, at last, as a slave to the pharaoh. She became his most favorite servant, whom he loved to keep in constant attendance and talk to, because she could understand him. While passing through this town, which was entirely built of mud houses, she saw a stately building of solid stone in its midst. Who dwells in there? She inquired from a passer-by. The savior god of the city, was the reply. All agog, she hurried thither, but the priest who stood at the gate with a rod in his hand, forbade her to enter. This increased her curiosity all the more. And walking around the house she discovered a chink in the wall through which she could peer into a dark chamber, and also saw what appeared to be a most luxuriously kept, enormous crocodile. She laughed. She saw no purpose in making a secret of this one, when hundreds of his brothers lay along the banks of the Nile constantly exposed to the view of anyone who cared to look at them. Suddenly she got thoughtful, and seemed to remember the scene on the banks of Saraswati, where she had seen an Anarayan worshipping a snake. But no one there had ever put an animal into a temple. Proceeding in her walk, she came to what looked like a big mount, wherein a dead man was being interred. What really startled her was, that not only his furniture and household things, but living animals and women were being herded in to be buried with the dead body. Remembering the night when she was in danger of being burnt alive on the funeral pyre, she felt horror-struck, and in one breath she ran back to the palace. Throwing herself at the feet of her master, she inquired what this meant. So this strikes you as improper? It has appeared to me likewise since my childhood, said her master, and smiled. We seem to be of a kindred spirit. So far the priests have obstructed my way to reform these cruel customs, but now no more shall I tolerate their opposition. I shall establish the worship of the true God. Honored master, said the brown girl, I am myself in search of the real God. Come, I will show him to you, said the pharaoh, and taking her upon an open terrace, he pointed with ecstasy to the sun, and said, Aren't men mad? Is it not plain that he is the author of the earth and of all life on it, and of us too? The glorious atom, can they worship any other god in the presence of him? His ecstatic mood and his graceful manner reminded the brown girl of the flute prince, who, too, had become a king and ruled so many towns and villages, and before whom even the Brahmins had bent their knees. She was not surprised to find that here, too, a king was leading men to God. I remember to have poured libations to this beautiful god, she said. But wasn't there also Varuna, the refulgent sky god, who wears the starry dress? Is he not the father of this god? I, too, have felt some being higher than Atom, said the pharaoh. But for me this glorious god is quite enough. He has honored me to be his high priest and son. In spite of all the assurances of the pharaoh, the funeral scene never left the mind of the brown girl. She had fled from the live burning, and now the live burial threatened her. She continuously contemplated flight, and the pharaoh's absence, when he was building a new city for himself, gave her the desired opportunity to make good her escape. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. After managing to get out of the city gate, she wended her way to the misty hills in the distance, till she met a large multitude of people, led by a tall, long-bearded, square-shouldered, venerable man, who carried a long staff in his hand. Would to God we had remained in Egypt, where we sat by the flesh pots, and where we could eat our fill, cried some of the people. Cowards and ungrateful men, said their leader, wrathfully, this is the way you thank the God of Israel, who has delivered you from the slavery of the pharaohs, where your every male child was to be killed. Are you, then, nothing but stomachs? Man eats, to live a decent and useful life. But if he is condemned to live like a groveling pig and a slave, need he then live at all? And when life itself becomes a degradation, where does the eating or not eating come in? You would sell your birthright for pottage, eh? Shame on you. Just behold. There your God appears in the cloud, he is the best of all gods. The brown girl intently looked into the cloud. She remembered the cloud god, but the God in the cloud she could not quite comprehend. As soon as bread and meal had been promised to the grumblers, and they had settled down at the foot of a mountain, she ventured to speak to the leader. You spoke of the God in the cloud, she said. I could not see him, could you show him to me? Look there, cried the leader again, pointing to the top of the mountain. He has descended on the Mount of Sinai in fire and smoke. Do you not see the mountain quaking? Once again the brown girl, all eyes, looked at the mountain peak. The fire god was clearly in her mind, but God in the fire again confounded her. Still I cannot see him. Oh how I long to see him, she said. Woman, cried the leader, angrily, you are crazy. Don't you hear the clear voice saying that you cannot see him or else you will perish? Don't you hear the voice saying that except me and my brother Aaron, not even priests are allowed to approach the mountain top? Presently, he gave orders that an altar should be built, and a ram to be killed as a sacrifice to the Lord. The ram's blood was to be thrown on the altar and sprinkled on the people, and the tip of his brother's right ear was to be painted with it. Some part of the flesh was being burnt, so that the smoke should reach the god. The brown girl dimly remembered the same sacrifices, even of human beings, and then of horses and other animals, so this did not surprise her. After some time she heard interminable instructions being given about the building of a tabernacle. Detailed instructions about the altar of gold, curtains of linen blue, purple and scarlet their measurements, brass and gold rings, sockets of silver, candlesticks, bars of chitting wood and ashpans, the oil and spices with which the tabernacle was to be anointed, the garments of the leader's brother, his girdle, his breastplate, embroidered robes and mitres, and the ceremonies that were to be performed at the altar, such as blood offerings and burnt offerings. These rites and ceremonies woke up in her subconscious impressions of the rites she used to perform herself. It pleased her, however, when the leader strictly prohibited the making of images of stone or metal, for since she had seen her living God, such were absolutely dead objects to her. She also felt relieved that he made no mention of ancestral spirits and their feeding. She admired the wonderful 10 Commandments, and the wise laws he gave to his followers. On the whole, she was much impressed and inspired by the personality and the zeal of this venerable leader. It was just when he had gone up to the mountain that one married man asked her to marry him, because, he said, no woman should walk about without a guardian. I have already been married, and I have no mind to marry again, said the brown girl. Have you children? Asked the man. No, replied the brown girl. So you are barren, he said. If I inform the people of that, you will be an outcast. At that moment a noise arose. Fit men were called out to cross the Jordan as the leader had desired. The man was compelled to attend to the call, and she was glad for the God-sent opportunity to slip away. Once again tears ran from her eyes, and it was strange that, through the silver mist of her tears, she seemed to see a palace in the distance, and without any conscious effort on her part she felt herself moving towards it, till at last she entered the vineyard adjoining the palace. Suddenly her eye fell on a beautiful prince, walking in the vineyard. His complexion reminded her of the flute prince, and for a moment she mistook him to be the same, for he, too, had a musical instrument which he was playing, and he was reciting these verses. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine. I am black, but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun has looked upon me. He seemed to understand the birds and beasts, and he seemed to rejoice in all nature around him. As if in a trance, she entered within his palace, which was built of hewed stone and cedar wood, with brass pillars. She found a veritable city of splendor inside it, and hundreds of his lovely queens and slave ephels. She, too, saw there the tabernacle she had seen before, and on the other side she beheld throngs of wonderful horses, chariots and warriors. She did not know whether the whole thing was real, or only her imagination, because the prince was a perfect replica of the cowherd boy. Perhaps he really was the same, her prince, her idol, her god, now in this palace, amongst his queens and horses and warriors, as had been described to her by the hoary forest dweller. With a cry of ecstasy, she ran towards him to ask him if he did recognize his gopi. But in this moment, the tear that had lingered on her eyelash, rolled down her cheek, and the whole scene had disappeared like a mirage. Have I gone mad? She said to herself. Since I have left my flute prince, I seem to see nothing but his images everywhere. The priests and their whole tribe I have left behind, and wherever I go, or roam in thought, a beautiful and wise prince is leading his people, and is the object of adoration to the priests themselves. My feet are ever wanting to walk to the Bindraban forest, where I first heard his flute. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. So saying, she resumed her wanderings. A well-known, fresh scent, wafted by the breeze, told her that she was not far from the place of her objective. As she entered the woods, a painful sight presented itself to her. Scores of men were doing most torturous penances, unmindful of the whole world around them. She ran to help a man, who was hanging upside down, his feet bound to a branch of a tree. At her approach, the man furiously asked her to mind her own business, and not to interfere with that of others. This made her quicken her pace to get out of the wood. It was not long before she arrived at the outskirts of a small village, and found a most impressive figure, although in the garb of a beggar, squatting under a large peepal tree. Finding the shade agreeable, and being very tired, she advanced to sit down at a short distance from him. Please spare the worm, he said, anxiously, yet gently. She stepped aside in compliance, and saw an earthworm near her feet. Are you fond of worms? She asked. They are no better and no worse than we ourselves, Lai replied, and the brown girl rejoined. I have learnt to love birds, the trees, and the flowers, but I don't care for worms. Upon this he smiled gently, and said, I see, you are already on the way. It requires only a little further stretch of love to get the worm within its circle. I am sure I have never come across a man like you before, said the brown girl. I was just in search of a beautiful, divine prince in these woods, where I met him first. He did not teach me to love anything. He just loved, and I, too, had to love. But then I do remember that at that time, and a little before, people used to sacrifice their children at the altar of their gods, and scores of animals, too. Do you prohibit these sacrifices to the gods? Gods need no sacrifices, he replied. Besides, gods themselves are helpless, and must go through this wheel of life as man himself. Have you found happiness in your life? I can't say so much for myself, but I have seen princes who appeared very happy, replied the brown girl. He again smiled gently. I, too, have been a prince at one time, he said. I had a paradisal palace to live in, and a most beautiful princess to love. And yet I found that from birth onward man is attended by pain. The more a man clings to this life, and what it brings, the more unhappy he becomes. I left everything to find a solution for the misery of the world and the unhappiness that pervades all around. I am glad to say that my renunciation has borne fruit, and that now I can call myself the Pathfinder. Had you also to do all the penances to find the path? Asked the brown girl. Oh, no, he replied, I did the penances, but I found no profit in them. If you have found the path to God, then please show it to me, said the brown girl. I have found the path to nirvana, he said, that bliss without a shadow. Man must prepare his own mind so that it ceases to long for anything. It is a difficult path to walk. It is almost like scaling a very steep mountain. My true follower is one who has no house, no wife, who never cooks his food, who lives on what he gets in his alms bowl, and who renounces what the people call the life of the world. So long, one desire rankles in the mind of man, it once again engenders life, which is the source of sorrow. The world has become used to walk the Anarian path of craving, of the lust of the flesh, the lust of life, and the lust of the present world. But I offer to them the eightfold Aryan path. The last words startled the brown girl. Master, she said, I do remember the Aryan way. It was to adopt a settled life, and never to roam, to own and cultivate land, never to leave the hearth, and keep yourselves ever alight, and sacrifice to the gods and to the spirits of ancestors. To possess sons, without which no man can get to heaven. It was possession, and not renunciation. But your teaching appears to me to be exactly the contrary, and yet you call it the Aryan path. It was an illusion to call that other the Aryan path, he said. It is through possessions, relationships, rights, and external performance wakeful man has created, that he finds unhappiness in the world multiplied hundredfold. He will have to sever those connections, which continuously drag him to earth and settle him on it. He will have to get rid of all desires for the life of this world and for the life of what he calls heaven. Man has no ancestors but desire. Man has no home but desire. Man has no children but children of desire. Man will have to get rid of all that, before he can even see happiness at all. But what is happiness? Asked the brown girl. To put an end to rebirth and renewal of life, aad the misery that ever attends upon it, he replied. The brown girl was confounded. She thought the only little happiness that she had found in this life of ups and downs, was to seek her godlike prince. But for that search, she would have found life unbearable, and she could not understand how the longing and the desiring could be a source of unhappiness, yet, she could not but think that this new prince in beggar garb, was gentle, beautiful and wise beyond description, and she could not bring herself to believe that what he was saying could ever be an untruth, and this made her difficulties all the more insoluble. Kissing his hands, and asking for his blessing, which was given as soon as asked, she took leave of him and wended her way to the village. As she entered the village temple, she saw an image of what was supposed to be a god, dark blue in color, and with a flute in his hand. The complexion and the flute reminded her of the prince she was in search of. She was certain that she had not seen this image in any temple before. She bowed to the priest, and asked for the name of that god. This is Krishna, the Dark One, the eighth incarnation of the great Vishnu, the Lord of the Gopis, replied the priest. The brown girl was beyond herself with joy. After all, the prince she had met had been a god. Where can I find him? She asked the priest. I thought he was dead. Stop your profanities, said the priest, you could never have seen the god, nor can a god die. Pray, tell me where I can find him, repeated the brown girl anxiously. Vlirupan the priest cried angrily. Don't you see the great one in your front? Vet you ask where you can find him. You seem to be out of your mind. No wonder, he continued, furiously, the times are out of joint. As was predicted by the great ancients, the demon has actually arisen to destroy the gods and preach unheard of beliefs, and the demon is being called even Boodly, the Pathfinder. He had talked himself into a frenzy, and his attitude became so very threatening, that the brown girl quickly left the temple. So they don't think that a god can be born and die, she said to herself. They have represented all their gods in human forms, and yet they don't seem to like the idea that a beautiful human being should be the GCD. Was it, then, all an illusion of my own mind, that, after the water, the fire, and the clouds, I thought that perhaps the real god was the human being himself? But the priest said GCDs are never born, and never die. How ugly and soulless looks that stone whom they call God, in comparison to my living prince, who was actually born, and who died. Here she suddenly broke off, remembering the words of the great Pathfinder about scaling the mountain. Sick asterisk asterisk. In disgust, she left the valleys behind, and started climbing. After a long and tortuous journey, she arrived at a grove that abounded with blossoming cherry trees. A number of men wearing long gowns and pigtails were seated on mats, sipping a hot beverage from daintily painted cups, served by a woman with tiny feet. The brown girl sat down in a corner and listened to what was being talked. An elderly man, who seemed to be much respected by everyone, said, "The only thing I must tell you about is the way. Human beings waste themselves with external activities of all sort. The way asterisk requires doing nothing. The way also demands that you should return good for evil. My honored friend Lao Tzu, said a slightly younger man, to return good for evil. Evil must be punished. Justice, my honored friend, justice. Besides, to do nothing. Why, you must help your neighbor and yourself. Only what you do not like when done to yourself, do not do to others." "This is right, my honored master Confucius," said another man. "But should we not serve the spirits of our ancestors as did all those who lived before us?" "My good man," replied Confucius, "when we cannot serve ourselves, how can we serve the spirits?" Several others took part in the discussion, which lasted till, agreeing to disagree, the party broke up. The brown girl was moved by the words "the way," which had been uttered by the speaker called Lao Tzu, as it carried her thoughts back to the saintly pathfinder, and suddenly a vision presented itself before her eyes. She saw the whole country flooded with the sculptured statues of the pathfinder, and he being worshipped as God himself. The vision passed off as swiftly as it had come. She smiled. Imagination seems to work, she said to herself. Have seen one prince being worshipped as a god, and the suggestion has created this vision. She was woken from her thoughts by the pitiable ties of a young girl, who was being sold by her father to a rough-looking, elderly man, and who was opposing the bargain with all her might. The brown girl remembered in a lightning flash all lie horrors that she had experienced when she had been a slave in the Pharaoh's land, and had seen the slave women being boiled alive. Alarm had sounded once again. Yet she dared not recross the mountains, and so she once more took to the road and wandered towards the west. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. It didn't seem very long before she arrived in a well-built city of fair people in the midst of a festival. "In whose honor is this feast?" she asked a passerby. "In honor of Dionysius, the giver of the grape and the god of wine," was the reply. That reminded her at once of Homer and Soma and the drink rites which she knew so well. "Which are the other gods worshipped here in this place?" she asked. "Demeter, the goddess of earth fertility, also Apollo and Athene," replied the man. "But who are you?" he continued, with a suspicious glance at her. "Are you a barbarian or a slave? Because no decent woman of your age may walk in the streets." Then, as if suddenly remembering the feast, he went on, "Not even on a festival day, at least, not without attendance. And if you are a barbarian, who is your patron?" At this moment a grotesque-looking, short man arrived on the scene, and the speaker bowed. "Hail, Socrates," he said, and the man thus addressed saluted in turn, and then said, with a smile, "Well, friend, have you found anyone not quite filled with the god? Is there anyone left with whom one can speak sense?" "I have at least found one," replied the other, pointing at the brown girl, "but a very doubtful one. Are you a newcomer to this city?" asked Socrates, turning to her. "Yes, master," she replied. "Who are your gods?" he asked further. "To tell you the truth, I am in search of God," replied the brown girl. "I have worshipped many, but I have been growing more and more doubtful whether I have found any true God at all." Socrates roared with laughter. "I am afraid many of us here, too, are becoming skeptical," he said. "The gods that behave worse than men would not be of much use to men. When they can't help themselves, how can they help others? But I know," he added, "the gods do not err. It is the poets that create those lies. The chief thing is to acquire wisdom, because virtue itself is wisdom. Argue with yourself, and argue with others, we can only arrive at the truth by argument. But, Prav, don't pay for learning ahem, because there are plenty here to rob you of your money and teach you false arguments. Is this wine god the greatest god in this city? Asked the brown girl, who had not exactly followed his talk on arguments. Yes, especially in the winter months. He is the greatest god of Delphi, he replied, and continued, wine is useful in cold weather. Today, people don't think of Zeus even as much as of Demeter, the goddess of corn. The stomach comes first in Athens, as much as anywhere else. Do you believe in these gods? Asked the brown girl. Oh yes, certainly, was the reply. I pray to them, and sacrifice to them, but I must confess that a voice tells me that there is something higher than these, which must be aboriginal. Hail, master! I have been searching you everywhere, cried now a younger man from behind them. Socrates turned round, and with undisguised joy he replied. Welcome. Son of Ariston, how is your republic thriving? Has perfection already been accomplished? So far, replied the other. Anyway, I have no place for poets in my republic, because they are corrupters of men, and once a man's soul is corrupted, it can only reappear either in a beast or in a woman. The only class that cannot be dispensed with is the slave class. The most important class, naturally, is that of the soldiers, the only class worth educating, and indeed should be carefully educated, more so, since Aristotle, my pupil, says that the northern people are barbarians, and their only occupation is fighting. He also agrees with me that traders, artisans, and laborers can never become virtuous. I have, however, come to the conclusion that the real world that matters is the world of idea, and not the material world. The world of ideas must have existed before the world of objects. Ideas are like patterns after which the objects are made. Pardon me, said the brown girl, suddenly quite alert, I think you will have to prove your statement by arguments. I wonder if you can ever get an idea of anything before you actually say something. I have all my life seen things, and the first words that I have uttered were, oh, I had no idea of this before. So you must excuse me if what you just now said appears topsy-turvy to me. I think the damsel is quite right, son of Ariston, said Socrates. You haven't advanced any cogent arguments to prove your statement, but I am afraid you are yourself a bit of a poet. And turning to the brown girl, he continued, have you any further arguments in support of your opinion? I am not an expert at argumentation, she replied. But my personal experience is all against such a proposition. As a child, I saw only objects as they are, and had no ideas about them. I had to see each object more than once, before I could conclude that it was the same object seen at different times, and then alone the idea of the object arose in my mind. But I am only talking of my personal experience. I am afraid she is right, said Socrates to the other. Your arguments are not yet so convincing. As far as our actual experience is concerned, impressions precede ideas. I confess that my arguments are not yet convincing to the outsider, said the son of Ariston. But nonetheless, personally I am fully convinced. But, master, I sought you because I wanted to take you to the Delphi, and I think we should be going. Socrates apologized to the brown girl for not sending her to his own house in Xanthip, but he directed her to a spacious house, where, he said, she would receive every attention, and where he would be glad to see her again. On her way to a spacious house she passed by a temple, where a crowd of people had collected, and, being curious to see a temple in this country, she proceeded towards it. As she entered, she saw a small girl being sacrificed at the altar. She rushed to snatch the victim away, when the priest held her back and cried, "Mad woman! How dare you profane the sacrifice of the god?" "Oh, but she is too young to die," pleaded the brown girl. "Will it be better to throw the girl outside the town to die of hunger and cold, as is the fate of so many hundreds, to keep the population within normal limits, or is it better to sacrifice her to the gods, ***, said the priest, sternly. When the brown girl heard that in this country children were exposed to death by their parents, and that this course of conduct was being advocated by the most learned of the land, she felt horror-struck. She was, however, surprised at her own feelings, and she asked herself, why am I so horrified at this? Do I not remember to have seen human sacrifices before? In an instant the ink dent of the Pathfinder and the worm came to her mind, and she sighed, how have I changed since then? Suddenly, a soldier caught her by the wrist. Who are you? He shouted. Who is your patron? How dare you come here and profane the sacrifice of the god? He dragged her out of the temple, and brought her before a tribunal. Your fit punishment is to be flogged and crucified, said the court. But as you are an absolute newcomer, and ignorant of the laws of this CE, the jury recommends you for mercy, and you are sentenced to be branded and sold as a slave. Thereupon she was branded with a hot iron on her left shoulder, and auctioned in the marketplace. A Roman patrician who happened to be there, purchased her. Girl, you will not find Rome as beautiful as this city, he said to her. We haven't got such lovely gods. No one can make such beautiful statues there, but we are just building a temple to these gods, and will introduce them there. The very idea frightened her, because she never could separate these beautiful-looking gods from human malefices. At once her purchaser changed his attitude, and said, I must tell you, however, that, docile as you find the, if you dare to look so inattentive in the presence of my father, he will kill you. The brown girl, to her grief, realized the truth of these words when they reached Rome. Although her empty-old duty was to serve the wife of the man who had bought her, her mistress herself was almost a slave to her husband's father, the head of the household, the ruler mid the high priest. He could even kill any of them with impunity. A fig tree and an oak in the houseyard were constant objects of worship to the household. The door of the house was worshipped by the men with much solemnity and ritual, likewise, the blazing hearth, by the women. This was enough to bring the remotest past back to the brown girl's mind, while the strictness of the ritual that accompanied every act of life, did remind her of those tiring days when she used to wash the eyesight of the Brahmins. She could not appease herself, Hatta people, who in many respects appeared well-to-do and sensible, should still be worshipping, not only the tree and hearth, but the two-faced house-door god, with nil solemnity. She laughed till her sides ached when she thought of it. Geese was enough to make one a skeptic, she thought, but in Rome one could not help but become a cynic. It was some time before she could see the state temple. This, she learnt from her mistress, was dedicated to the godfather, the sky god, who was represented by a spear, and to the god Terminus, the bounder stone god, who was there in form of a stone. Can't I accompany you to the temple and see the gods? She asked her mistress, concealing with difficulty her amusement. You foolish girl, replied her mistress, alarmed. Nobody dares to approach the gods except the patricians. You are a slave, but not even the plebeians dare have recourse to them. In all matters the gods have to be consulted, and the patricians alone can consult them. Are there, then, no public sacrifices? Asked the brown girl again. Oh yes, replied her mistress. Lately there was a human sacrifice in the forum to the Greek deities, at the direction of the Sibylline book. The brown girl was disgusted, and could ask no more. The very name God now began to stink in her nostrils. She felt as though an age had passed before she saw that a temple was being built in honor of the great Caesar, who had been deified, and henceforward the emperors were themselves to be worshipped. Still more gods, said the brown girl to herself. But this one did not take long to become one, only yesterday he was being abused as a tyrant. It seems a quicker process has come into operation. In these surroundings she found life intolerable and degrading, and her only wish was to get away. The opportunity was hot long in coming. At one of the usual spring festivals, where everyone in the house was practically drunk, her mistress, in a fit of generosity, threw one of her robes to her, and also bestowed on her some of her ornaments. The brown girl found the occasion very welcome. In an hour she was dressed, and had left the house of the patrician behind. ******. The memories of her past wanderings sustained her during this difficult journey, till she arrived on a small hill, where she saw a crowd of people sitting in a circle. A lad was holding a tray, whereupon lay a few loaves and fishes. A man who stood near, and whom they called the Nazarene, extended his arm over the tray, and at once the loaves and fishes multiplied to such an extent that all the people present were fed, and yet so many basketfuls were left over. After they had eaten, a blind man was presented to the Nazarene, who touched his eyes, whereupon he could see instantly. Then a woman came and took him to a grave, and uncovered it. He called the dead man by his name, and he rose and walked out in his winding sheet. The brown girl was astonished at the sight of these unusual happenings. She thought this man would certainly be able to tell her about the things that had so far puzzled her, so she respectfully approached him, and said, "Master, you have performed wonders." "Havel," he laughed. "These perverse, childish people are attracted only by unusual happenings and novelties, and more than that, by greed for loaves and fishes, and for the life of flesh. Now you will see that, although I have slipped them, they will run after me, not for anything else but for more loaves and fishes. Alas," he continued, with a sad mien. "Hundreds of times I repeat to them that their ancestors ate this bread, and they are all dead, that life of flesh meant death eternal, that I wanted to give them bread of life and life eternal, but none of them would want that. Should one not seek to find food and raiment, and work for it?" asked the brown girl. "Take no thought for what you shall eat, and what you shall drink," he replied. "Behold the fowls of the air, they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet they are fed. And why take you thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin, and yet, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Seek ye first the kingdom of God." "But master, where is the kingdom of God?" asked the brown girl. "The kingdom of God is within you," he replied. "Strait is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto it, and very few will find it." The idea of not working for one's living, and of the difficult way, and the importance attached to the life of the mind, and disregard to the external things, and the world, together with the man's gentleness, reminded her of the Pathfinder. At this moment a man came up to them, and desired to follow the Nazarene, but he asked him whether he could first bury his dead father. "Let the dead bury their dead," said the Nazarene. "If any cometh to me, and hateth not his father and his mother and his wife and his children, and his brethren and his sisters and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Can't you see, man, that even the foxes have their lairs, but that I keep no house?" The brown girl was not very surprised at these words, although she found them rather strong. She had already heard the Pathfinder say that the householder's life was not congenial to finding nirvana, that man should live on what he received in his alms bowl, and that he must renounce his family, his relations, his home and all his possessions. Had not the Pathfinder Prince done the same thing himself? In fact, the words of the Nazarene made her respect this gentle, saintly man all the more, and she seriously began to search the truth of his sayings, although it was very hard to understand what he really meant. But what a contrast it was to the life and the kind of people that she had just left behind. She actually felt refreshed. Once more she began to recover faith that perhaps, after all, some true God was there and must be sought. Her interest in the Nazarene grew enormously, and she resolved to learn more from him. So she accompanied him to an inn, where he, with several other men, sat down to take meals. An Israelite came and rebuked them, saying that it was against the law of Moses to cat with unwashed hands. "Unwashed hands do not defile, it is the unwashed mind that defiles a man," said the Nazarene. The Israelite was irritated, and asked him if he was a king to give a new law. "My kingdom is not of this world," he replied. "Likewise, you should seek heaven and have nothing to do with this world." He then called 12 persons, and told them to go and preach about the kingdom of heaven to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The brown girl remembered the people of Israel, and the days when the tabernacle was being built, and all the great care that had been used to build it. The remembrance of the strict ritual again reminded her of the days in that far past when she used to wash the feet of the Brahmins. In her heart she was drawn to this Nazarene, as she had been drawn to the Pathfinder, because they both discarded the necessity of external form and ritual. Once again she approached the Nazarene, and asked, "Good master, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" The Nazarene sharply turned to her, and said, "Pray do not call me good. None is good save Lord." Then he added, "To inherit the kingdom of heaven you must leave everything behind and have no possessions whatsoever. You must not resist evil, and you must make yourself humble before everybody, and you must not judge anyone." "But, Master," said the brown girl, surprised, "what should the rulers do?" "I am not concerned with the rule of this world and its rulers," he replied. "Should we do the bidding of the king?" she asked. "Yes, render unto the king what belongs to the king," he replied. "You have told me not to do so many things," said the brown girl, "but what shall I actually do to lind heaven?" "Love God and love your neighbor as yourself," replied the Nazarene. "How can I love a thing that I have never seen?" said the brown girl. "I am just seeking God to see whether I am at all able to love him." "Watch and pray," he said gently. "Be like those careful virgins who kept the lamps burning, so that when the bridegroom came, he took them all inside as his brides, and those who had slept were left outside." "How shall I pray?" she asked. "Shut yourself in a closet," he replied, "and say, 'Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.'" Why? The brown girl listened attentively. Once again she was puzzled. The words "give us our daily bread" from the lips of him who continuously was saying that we should not give any thought to food and raiment, seemed strange. Nor could she quite understand meaning of the words, "forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." How could we, she thought, be an example to God? Besides, the idea of give and take did not appeal to her. The horrible occurrences that followed, and the loss of her loved teacher, pained her immensely. Again she ruminated over all what she had learnt this time, and more she realized that but for minor differences, such as seeking the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdom of God, when the Pathfinder had talked about nirvana, the method of these two great men agreed almost in all details. This life was to be discarded. This world was to be eschewed. Possessions, family relationships, hearth and home, was all to be left behind, and any thought of earning one's living, and the thought of marrying, were repugnant to them both, as they did show in their personal conduct. Two great men of this type, she thought, when they agree with each other in almost every detail of their teaching, they could not both be wrong. The only thing to do was to put their teaching into practice. At this moment a vision came before her eyes. Icy saw the whole east covered with followers of the Pathfinder calling themselves bhikshus, beggars, the most honorable name that the Pathfinder himself had contrived for them, and she saw the whole west covered with monasteries and mendicant friars, the most honorable religious orders of the day. This vision of the future nil the more strengthened her resolution to take to a secluded life away from the world and its doings, where, like kingdom of heaven could be exclusively sought, and she prepared herself to take the three required vows law initiation, namely, that of poverty, chastity, and obedience. After all the wanderings, this self-imposed imprisonment, where she had no recourse to the outside world at all, was very interesting to her. It provided her an opportunity for thinking over all she had gone through, and at the same time examining the motions and emotions of her own inner mind. Side by side, the disciplinary prayers and formalities that she had to perform at the command of the matron, though naturally unpleasant to her, were still borne by her with nil cheerfulness under her vow of obedience. The worship of the cross she could understand as a preparation to be able to suffer without complaint, but the worship of the Nazarene as a GCD, confounded her, because she remembered his words, "Why is thou me good? None but God is good." This Nazarene worship, however, reminded her of her vision, in which she had seen the Pathfinder being worshipped as a god, a man who had strictly prohibited the worship of any god at all. It also reminded her of the flute prince and of all the other god formations she had witnessed in her wanderings. What she found most irksome was that the slightest regard towards cleanliness of her body was looked upon with suspicion, and was strictly prohibited, so much so, that ordinary washing went entirely out of use and custom. At last, she resolved to be cleared on that point, and she asked the matron, "Is it a sin to bathe?" "Yes," was the stern reply. "Any regard for the body is a sin. Don't you remember the saying of our Lord, that eating with unwashed hands does not defile?" The brown girl was not satisfied with this reply, but her own vow of obedience made her silent. In course of time, all her doings turned into a routine, which she went through more or less like a machine. This made her listless and melancholic, and the need of freedom, motion, action, and interest in life asserted themselves, and she longed to be out of this prison. It was soon after that a fire broke out in the nunnery, and everyone had to run for life, although some of the nuns would rather be burnt alive than leave their places. But the brown girl, who already had lived out this self-imposed restraint, was glad to be out, and before anyone could take notice of her, she was gone. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. She was surprised to find the world quite different to what she had left. The new prayer houses were thronged with idols. Everywhere she saw images of the mother of the Nazarene, who was being worshipped as a goddess, and a father god and a sun god reminded her of all the past gods she had known. Greatly as she rejoiced over her freedom, it was not going to be of long duration. She happened to speak to a man about religion, and remarked that retirement to monasteries and nunneries, and the routine it entailed, was tiring. This being reported to the bishop, she was arrested and charged with tempting young men and corrupting their beliefs. As she also looked a bit outlandish, she was accused of witchcraft, and ordered to be burnt alive. A young scribe, however, had lost his heart to her intelligent and bewitching eyes, and it was through his clandestine assistance that she once again found herself free and on the way to a far-off desert land, to avoid to be seen once again in the same place. Her arrival in the very first village proved a death knell to her freedom. She was captured by the head of the village as his prize, and brought to his house, where he counted his dead father's wives amongst his own consorts. On the day of her arrival, a daughter was born in the family, which was at once ordered to be taken away and buried alive. Soon after, the man desired to sell the brown girl, and he took her to a larger town, where a big fair was in progress. On their arrival there, she saw a small temple, in which stones represented so many gods and goddesses, and which was visited as a place of pilgrimage. The brown girl, finding herself, after all these trials, in this uncouth mob, lost her nerve, and sinking to the ground, she burst out weeping. Her captor, who wanted her to look her best in order to fetch a big price, took out his whip and threatened her to behave herself and try to look attractive. It was just at this moment that she heard someone say to him, "May I tell you the way that will fetch you 70 times more than you ever can get for this girl? Is it not better to walk the steep way and get to safety and to height, than to go doven for a momentary little ease?" "And what is this steep road you want me to walk on?" asked her captor. "The first step on this path is to free the slave," was the reply. "And that also a woman?" laughed her captor, whereupon the other spoke again. "And who knows that there be a great deal of good in what you call a woman? Besides, was not you a mother a woman too? Is not man and woman one from the other? If you think you have rights over them, have they no rights over you? Let me tell you that paradise lies beneath the feet of mothers." The brown girl for the moment forgot all her sorrows. She looked up and stared at the speaker, as if he had come from some different world. It was not only that for the first time in all her experiences she had heard the words "free the slave," but also that woman was such an exalted creature that the paradise of the man-child lay beneath her feet. Then an inconceivable thing happened. Her captor seemed overcome by what he had heard, and, helping her to rise from the ground, he told her that she was free and could go where she liked. She fell at the feet of the stranger to thank him, but he said, "You must thank God, your true deliverer, because I only repeated his words to the man who freed you. They are not mine. I am only a messenger, or else a poor mortal like you or anybody else." The brown girl listened to his beautiful voice with downcast eyes, as though in a trance, and when she looked up he had gone, and she was alone amidst the rough crowd.